Picture yourself standing in ancient Rome, dressed in flame-colored silk, surrounded by the scent of burning torches and scattered walnuts crushing beneath your feet. You've just walked through streets lined with cheering crowds, their voices raised in songs so explicit they make your cheeks burn. You thought you understood what marriage meant. You thought tonight would be about joining your life with another's, about stepping into adulthood with dignity and grace. But as tradition dictates, before your husband can approach you on your wedding night, you must first greet a god whose very name made later Romans uncomfortable, a god represented by a wooden idol so explicitly carved that early Christian writers could barely bring themselves to describe it. In a few moments, you'll understand why this deity's shrine was destroyed even before Christianity rose to power. In a few moments, you'll learn what certain elite Roman marriages truly demanded. And in a few moments, you'll discover why the Church worked so hard to erase every trace of this practice from historical memory. This isn't speculation or rumor. This ritual is documented by multiple ancient writers, both pagan and Christian. A practice so disturbing that even Roman historians avoided describing it directly. A ceremony so shameful that when Christianity rose to power, the Church didn't just condemn it. They systematically destroyed the evidence, smashed the statues, and tried to ensure the world would never know what really happened in some Roman wedding chambers. Today, we're pulling back the veil on a secret the Vatican hoped would stay buried forever: the horrifying truth about Mutunus Tutunus and what he demanded from Roman brides. When we think of Roman weddings today, we picture something almost romantic. The bride wore the flammeum, a bright saffron-colored veil that marked her as sacred during the transition from daughter to wife. According to ancient sources, her hair had been arranged at dawn in an elaborate style, parted with the tip of a spearhead and woven into 6 intricate braids. Every detail followed strict ancestral guidelines meant to invoke divine protection during this vulnerable moment. The wedding procession through the city streets was a spectacle that would be familiar to us in many ways. Young men shouted traditional verses along the route, some playful, others shockingly crude. These fescennine songs were deliberately obscene, meant to entertain the gods and ward off evil spirits through their very lewdness. Guests threw walnuts for fertility, their shells clattering across the cobblestones. The groom waited at his decorated doorway, wreathed in greenery and flanked by blazing torches that announced a marriage was about to be consummated. When he lifted his bride across the threshold, carrying her so her feet wouldn't touch the entrance and risk bad omens, the crowd roared their approval. At the ceremony itself, which typically took place in the atrium of the bride's family home, witnesses gathered to observe the formal joining. A matron called the pranuba, a woman who had been married only once and whose husband still lived, played a central ceremonial role. Ancient sources tell us she joined the right hands of the bride and groom in the most important moment of the public ceremony, the dextrarum iunctio. 10 witnesses signed the marriage contract, making the union legally recognized. The bride would speak the traditional words, ubi tu Gaius, ego Gaia, meaning, where you are, I shall be. It seemed joyous. It appeared civilized. It looked like the foundation of Western wedding traditions that we still follow today. But for certain elite families, particularly among the patrician class, this public ceremony was only the beginning. Behind the sealed doors of the wedding chamber, a very different ritual awaited some brides, one that had nothing to do with romance and everything to do with an ancient deity whose worship made even pagan Romans uncomfortable. Long before Christianity condemned pagan practices, Romans themselves felt ambivalent about Mutunus Tutunus. The 2nd century grammarian Festus is the only classical Latin writer who mentions this deity directly, and even his reference is brief and somewhat evasive. According to Festus, Mutunus Tutunus had a shrine on the Velian Hill, a low ridge connecting the Palatine to the Esquiline Hills near the Roman Forum. This shrine supposedly dated back to Rome's legendary founding, making it one of the city's most ancient religious sites. Yet despite this venerable age, the shrine was destroyed in the 1st century before the Common Era to make room for a private bath for Domitius Calvinus, a pontiff and supporter of Augustus. Even though Romans revered ancient religious sites and rarely destroyed them, this particular shrine was razed without apparent public outcry. This destruction suggests that even before Christianity arrived, Romans had grown uncomfortable with Mutunus Tutunus. The god's name itself derives from Latin slang terms for the penis, specifically muto and mutonium. He was quite explicitly a phallic deity associated with marriage and fertility. Based on the accounts that survived, his cult image wasn't a humanoid statue with exaggerated features, but rather a representation of the phallus itself, carved with anatomical explicitness that left no room for symbolic interpretation. What we know about the rituals associated with Mutunus Tutunus comes primarily from early Christian writers who described pagan practices they considered abhorrent. These sources must be approached with appropriate caution, as they had clear motivations to exaggerate or misrepresent pagan ceremonies to prove Christianity's moral superiority. However, the consistency of their descriptions across multiple independent writers, combined with Festus's brief pagan confirmation that the god was indeed worshipped by brides, suggests there's a core of truth beneath the hostile commentary. Augustine of Hippo, writing in his massive work, The City of God, during the early 5th century, described phallic rituals associated with Roman marriage. In Book 6, Augustine condemns how newly married brides were commanded to sit upon what he describes as Priapus's immense and most unsightly member, as part of the most honorable and most religious custom of matrons. While Augustine specifically names Priapus in this passage, scholars note that Priapus and Mutunus Tutunus were often equated or conflated in Roman religious thought, and that his broader critique encompassed the phallic marriage deities Romans worshipped. He framed these practices as definitive proof of pagan depravity, arguing that no honorable religion would demand such acts. Arnobius of Sicca, another Christian apologist writing in the late 3rd or early 4th century, provided even more explicit details in his work, Against the Nations. He specifically names Tutunus and asks rhetorically whether it's this deity on whose huge organs and bristling tool Romans think it appropriate that their matrons should be mounted. He employed the Latin verb inequitare, meaning to ride or mount, and emphasized the size of the representation in terms clearly meant to shock his Christian audience and demonstrate what he viewed as pagan obscenity. Lactantius, yet another early Christian writer, stated in his Divine Institutes that brides sat in Mutunus's, or Tutunus's, shameful lap, so that the deity could symbolically claim what he called the first fruits of their virginity before their husbands approached. Lactantius actually refused to describe the ritual in fuller detail, claiming the practice was too shameful to put into words even when condemning it. This reticence is telling. When ancient authors who lived in societies far less squeamish than ours about sexual matters found something too explicit to describe clearly, we should take that as significant evidence of exactly how invasive the ritual truly was. Modern historians examining these accounts have often tried to soften their implications. Perhaps some scholars have suggested the brides merely sat beside the statue symbolically, or touched it lightly as a gesture of respect to the fertility god. These gentler interpretations aim to make the ritual more palatable to contemporary sensibilities. However, the actual Latin vocabulary used by the ancient writers raises questions about these softer readings. The language choices are significant. Augustine used insidere, to sit upon, when describing the Priapus ritual, while Arnobius employed inequitare when discussing Tutunus, a term that suggests riding or straddling with more explicit connotations. These verb choices matter in Latin, a language that offered many options for describing different types of physical positioning. If the ritual had involved merely standing near the statue or touching it lightly, the writers likely would have used entirely different vocabulary. The specific verbs they selected could indicate more direct, weight-bearing contact than modern comfort allows us to imagine. Though we must also acknowledge that Christian writers had clear motivations to describe pagan practices in the most scandalous terms possible. The official explanation for this practice, at least according to later Roman understanding preserved in these hostile sources, centered on fertility and divine blessing. The ritual supposedly prepared the bride psychologically and perhaps physically for consummation, ensured the marriage would be fruitful, and invoked the god's protection against infertility or marital discord. This could represent a genuinely held religious belief about the proper way to begin a marriage under divine auspices. Fertility deities and phallic symbols appeared throughout the ancient Mediterranean world, and Romans weren't unique in associating explicit representations with concepts of abundance and new life. However, we can also recognize that such rituals, whether or not they occurred exactly as Christian writers described, would have served additional functions beyond their stated religious purposes. A ceremony involving a young bride and an explicitly phallic idol performed before witnesses would have effectively broken down psychological resistance and demonstrated submission before the wedding night itself began. For a young bride, typically around 12 to 15 years old, the legal minimum age was 12, though middle-class Romans often married in their mid to late teens, and often marrying a man she barely knew. Performing such a ritual in front of witnesses would have been profoundly intimidating. Whether intentionally designed this way or not, the practice would have created a psychological framework of compliance that extended into the private aspects of marriage that followed. One of the most challenging aspects of researching ancient Roman wedding practices is determining exactly who was present during various stages of the ceremony and what happened after the public rituals concluded. We must be extremely careful here to distinguish between what ancient sources actually document and what later writers have sometimes assumed or invented. The public wedding ceremony definitely included witnesses. Roman law was built on the testimony of witnesses for all major transactions, and marriage was no exception. Typically, 10 witnesses attended to sign the marriage contract and observe the formal joining of the couple. The pronuba, that married matron who helped guide the bride through the ceremony, was definitely present for the public rituals. Ancient artwork frequently shows her standing between the bride and groom, joining their hands or offering guidance. What becomes far less certain is what happened after the public ceremony ended and the bride entered her new husband's home. Some modern accounts claim that the pronuba remained present to supervise consummation, that bedroom doors were left open, that witnesses gave sworn testimony about the physical act itself. These claims appear frequently in popular histories and even in some academic discussions. However, when we return to the actual ancient sources, the evidence becomes remarkably thin. Roman literature and law focused intensely on whether consummation occurred because an unconsummated marriage could potentially be challenged or annulled. The legitimacy of future children depended on establishing that the marriage had been properly completed. But the methods Romans used to verify consummation remain frustratingly unclear in the historical record. Did they rely simply on the couple's word? On evidence like bedsheets, on the testimony of servants who heard sounds through doors? On more invasive verification methods? The sources don't give us clear answers. What we can say with confidence is that elite Roman families treated marriage as a legal transaction, requiring careful documentation, similar to the sale of property or land. Just as land transfers involved witnesses who observed boundaries and signed documents, marriages involved witnesses who could later testify that the ceremony occurred properly. The bride's virginity mattered enormously to these families because it directly affected questions of legitimacy and inheritance. Any doubt about whether a child was truly the husband's biological offspring could derail careful plans for passing down wealth and status. This created enormous pressure to ensure marriages were completed properly and that no questions could later arise. Some scholars have suggested that medical examinations of brides occurred before and after consummation, with physicians documenting virginity and its loss. However, we must acknowledge that direct evidence for this practice in the specific context of wedding nights is lacking in surviving Roman sources. Roman medical writers certainly discussed virginity and its physical signs in clinical terms, and we know Romans were capable of invasive medical procedures. but drawing a straight line from general medical knowledge to systematic verification as part of wedding ceremonies requires making inferences that go beyond what the sources explicitly state. The end of these practices didn't come from Romans deciding they had gone too far. It came from outside, from the gradual spread of Christianity through the empire and the transformation of Roman values during the 4th and 5th centuries. As Christian theology spread, new assumptions about human dignity, the soul, and the nature of marriage took hold throughout the Roman world. If women had souls equal to men in the eyes of God, they couldn't be treated as mere property to be verified and documented. If marriage was a sacred sacrament rather than primarily a legal contract, it couldn't include rituals the Church deemed obscene. If modesty was a cardinal virtue, as Christian teaching insisted, then any practices that treated the wedding night as a public verification event became morally intolerable. The shift happened gradually over several generations, proceeding at different paces in different regions. In cities where Christianity gained influence first, the old ceremonies began to fade. The pranuba's role diminished from active ceremonial participant to purely symbolic attendant, eventually disappearing from Christian wedding ceremonies altogether. The practice of involving witnesses beyond the public ceremony was abandoned. The invocation of pagan deities like Mutunus Tutunus became not just discouraged but actively condemned. But Christians didn't simply stop practicing these rituals and move on. They actively worked to erase all evidence the practices had ever existed. This systematic destruction of the historical record was remarkably thorough and clearly intentional. Any remaining representations of Mutunus Tutunus were destroyed. We have no surviving statues of this god, no intact shrines, no artwork depicting the rituals associated with his worship. This absence is striking when we consider how much Roman religious art survived for other deities. Statues of Jupiter, Venus, Mars, and hundreds of other gods were preserved even through centuries of Christian dominance. But Mutunus Tutunus left almost no physical trace. Texts that referenced the wedding rituals in detail were removed from libraries or left to decay through deliberate neglect. In an era when books were hand-copied and carefully maintained, choosing not to preserve certain texts was an effective form of censorship. Wall paintings or mosaics that may have depicted marriage ceremonies were plastered over or destroyed during church construction. Inscriptions mentioning the god were defaced. Within a few generations, the full knowledge of what certain Roman weddings had once included vanished from common memory, preserved only in scattered hostile references in Christian polemical writings. The Church Fathers who documented these practices did so not to preserve historical truth for future generations, but to demonstrate what they viewed as pagan depravity. Augustine, Arnobius, and Lactantius wrote about Mutunus Tutunus specifically to prove that pre-Christian Rome had been morally bankrupt, worshipping obscene gods and practicing shameful rites. Their disgust was genuine, but it served a clear rhetorical purpose. By exposing these practices in contexts that condemned them, they justified Christianity's conquest of Roman religious life. They could point to rituals like this and say, "See what Romans did before Christ brought them enlightenment? See why the old ways needed to be destroyed?" This systematic erasure was remarkably successful. By the medieval period, even scholars who could read Latin and studied classical texts had only the vaguest understanding of what these wedding rituals had involved. The sanitized version of Roman marriage, focused on the beautiful public ceremonies and legal contracts, became the dominant narrative passed down through centuries. The darker practices survived only in fragmentary references that most people never encountered. When Renaissance humanists rediscovered classical texts and began celebrating Roman civilization as a model to emulate, they worked from sources that had already been filtered through centuries of Christian censorship. The Rome they admired was a carefully edited version. Today, most people imagine Roman marriage through a lens shaped by centuries of Christian reinterpretation. We see the beautiful elements that survived into later European traditions: the bride carried across the threshold, the joining of hands, the exchange of vows. We've turned these practices into cherished customs, stripped of their original Roman legal and religious context. We don't think about the aspects that made elite Romans themselves uncomfortable long before Christianity arrived. We certainly don't think about practices that involved young brides performing rituals with phallic idols under circumstances that offered them no real choice to refuse. Understanding these hidden aspects of Roman marriage fundamentally complicates our view of classical civilization. Rome gave us remarkable achievements in law, engineering, literature, philosophy, and governance. Roman legal principles still influence Western jurisprudence today. Latin remains the foundation of multiple modern languages. Roman architectural innovations are studied and admired. But acknowledging what Rome demanded of women in certain marriage ceremonies forces us to recognize that legal sophistication and cultural refinement can coexist alongside practices that violate human dignity. A society can produce sublime art and literature while simultaneously maintaining customs that treat half its population as property, requiring documentation and verification. The selective preservation of history serves specific purposes. When the Church systematically destroyed evidence of practices like the worship of Mutunus Tutunus, they weren't just expressing religious disapproval. They were crafting a narrative about their own moral superiority and the necessity of their conquest of pagan culture. By the medieval period, Christians could look back at pagan Rome as a monolithically depraved civilization that Christianity had rescued and civilized. This narrative conveniently ignored that many Roman practices, including basic legal concepts and administrative structures, continued unchanged under Christian rule. It also ignored that some Roman values, such as their recognition of women's property rights and free marriages, actually represented advances that were sometimes lost under early Christian influence. The women who experienced these rituals left us no first-hand accounts. Elite Roman women rarely wrote memoirs or personal histories, and when they did write, discussing wedding night experiences would have been utterly taboo. This silence itself tells us something profound about how these practices were experienced and remembered. The absence of women's voices in the historical record isn't accidental or inevitable. It reflects systematic exclusion from education, from literary culture, and from the historical narratives that men considered worth preserving. When we study Roman history through surviving sources, we're almost always seeing it through male perspectives, filtered through male priorities, shaped by what men considered important to document. Modern historians face genuine challenges in reconstructing practices that powerful institutions spent centuries trying to erase. We're working with fragments, hostile Christian denunciations, brief mentions in grammatical texts, scattered archaeological hints that only make sense when placed together. We must approach these fragments critically, acknowledging the biases and limitations of each source while still trying to understand what actually happened. This requires intellectual honesty about what we know versus what we infer, what's documented versus what's speculation, what's certain versus what remains disputed among scholars. The systematic destruction of evidence by the Church represents more than just religious zeal. It demonstrates how controlling historical narratives serves political and ideological purposes. By determining what gets preserved and what gets destroyed, institutions shape how future generations understand the past. They control which civilizations get remembered as admirable versus deplorable, which practices get celebrated versus condemned, which voices get heard versus silenced. This pattern didn't end with early Christianity's treatment of Roman paganism. Throughout history, conquering powers have consistently destroyed the records and monuments of those they defeat, replacing them with narratives that justify the conquest itself. The ritual involving Mutunus Tutunus stands as a stark reminder that history is rarely as simple or as noble as we'd like to believe. Behind the grandeur of marble temples and the sophistication of Roman law existed practices that made even Romans themselves uncomfortable. Practices deemed shameful enough that an ancient shrine was destroyed to build a bathhouse long before Christian emperors came to power. The ceremony demanded of certain elite brides reveals a society that valued legal certainty and religious tradition in ways that, whatever their internal logic, treated young women as property whose status needed verification and documentation. We must be intellectually honest about the limitations of our knowledge here. The ancient sources we have are fragmentary, often hostile, and written exclusively by men. We don't have detailed procedural manuals explaining exactly how these rituals worked. We don't have the voices of the women who experienced them. We must distinguish carefully between what we know with reasonable certainty, what we can cautiously infer from limited evidence, and what remains speculation. Claims about extensive medical examinations or constant supervision during consummation go beyond what our sources actually document, even as we acknowledge that Romans certainly cared intensely about verification and legitimacy. What we can say with confidence is this: a phallic deity named Mutunus Tutunus was worshipped in ancient Rome, with a shrine on the Velian Hill. Multiple ancient writers, both pagan and Christian, confirm that brides interacted with representations of this god as part of marriage rituals. The language these writers used indicates this interaction was physically direct and explicit, not merely symbolic. This practice made later Romans uncomfortable enough that the shrine was destroyed even before Christianity's rise. When Christianity did gain power, the Church systematically erased evidence of this deity and associated practices, ensuring that by the medieval period, almost no one remembered what certain Roman wedding ceremonies had once included. The systematic erasure of these practices by Christian authorities created a gap in historical knowledge that persists to this day. Most people learn about Roman weddings without ever hearing about Mutunus Tutunus or the rituals that elite families practiced. This sanitization of history prevents us from fully understanding the past. It allows us to maintain comfortable myths about classical civilization while ignoring practices that contradict our desire to see Rome as an unambiguously admirable foundation for Western culture. Neither extreme view is accurate. Rome wasn't monolithically depraved, nor was it an enlightened paradise of law and order. It was a complex society with both remarkable achievements and troubling practices, often intertwined in ways that make simple moral judgments difficult. The young women who walked through torchlit streets in their saffron veils deserve to be remembered as real people who lived within systems they didn't create and couldn't refuse. They deserve to have their experiences acknowledged rather than erased. They deserve our recognition that what was done in the name of tradition and law violated human dignity regardless of the religious or legal justifications offered. And they deserve our commitment to ensuring that future generations learn full historical truths rather than sanitized versions designed to make us comfortable or to serve ideological purposes. If this hidden chapter of history has challenged what you thought you knew about ancient Rome, hit that like button and subscribe to The Codex of History. We're committed to bringing you the full, complicated truth about the past, even when that truth is uncomfortable. In the comments below, let me know where you're watching from and whether you'd heard anything about Mutunus Tutunus and Roman marriage rituals before today. History isn't always pleasant, but understanding the full truth about the past, with all its complexity and contradiction, is the only way we can learn from it rather than romanticizing it. Until next time, keep questioning the sanitized versions of history we've been taught, and keep seeking the truth beneath the surface.